Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. She walked 10 steps toward a latrine on the rim of the Nile and vanished. By sunrise, search grids cut through the brush, a helicopter circled overhead, and one question refused to fade. Accident or human intervention? This is a missing person case, not a homicide crime scene. The date is October 28, 2015. Location: the Student Education Center inside Murchison Falls National Park, Uganda. The subject is Sophia Ketzier, 21, a Dutch medical student finishing an internship in Kampala and taking a short safari with two fellow students and a Ugandan driver guide. After dusk, she told her friends she was stepping to the toilet block near the lodging. Minutes passed. She didn't return. The friends searched the immediate footpaths and common areas, then notified staff. Park rangers were called. There were no signs of forced entry or a fight in the lodging area, no overturned bedding, no blood patterning, no disrupted door hardware. The classification for this entire series remains consistent: scene of disappearance. Rapid response shaped the first 72 hours. Rangers and police extended searches along brush lines, elephant grass, and natural drifts toward water. K9 handlers worked scent where feasible. Aerial assets scanned breaks in canopy and sandbars. Negative findings mattered: no blood or drag marks on the primary approach to the river, no obvious slide or slip trough leading from the toilet block to the bank. Terrain checks documented slope, footing, and night visibility. Investigators compressed the time window between Sophia's last verified movement and the initial alert from her companions, a short interval that limits how far a person could walk unaided. The human picture stays lean and relevant. Sophia's routine that week, her travel pairing, and the guide's role establish opportunity, not motive. There's no 911 call here. The case isn't in the United States. The language we use is deliberate and narrow because each statement will be measured against the record. In U.S. investigative terms, we anchor this chapter to verifiable scene facts: a known last seen point, an absence of violence indicators inside the lodging, and a rapid escalation to an organized search. One detail, withheld until now, will carry into our next chapters. In the days following the disappearance, items attributed to Sophia were found on land, spaced in ways that raised questions about sequence and handling. We will map those finds precisely later. We won't repeat them throughout the series. For now, the record shows a clean lodging area, an immediate local search, and an officially documented large-scale effort that failed to locate Sophia or a body. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. The window between last seen and first alert was short, and that dictated everything that followed. After Sophia Coetzier stepped toward the toilet block near the Student Education Center inside Murchison Falls National Park on October 28, 2015, her companions searched the immediate area, notified staff, and rangers were called in. This remained a scene of disappearance. There were no indicators in the lodging area to reclassify it as a violent scene. Command organized the response around time, terrain, and probable movement range in darkness. Operations built a micro-timeline first. Investigators logged the moment she left the group, the point at which companions began calling out, and the time staff escalated. Those stamps produced a conservative movement radius measured in minutes on foot, not hours. Teams prioritized every walkable line from the lodging, the path to the latrines, the spur trails into brush, and the downhill corridors that gravity and habit create toward the Nile. The aim was simple: if this were a misstep, a drag, or a deliberate walk-off, the first sign should appear close. Search structure mattered. Foot teams advanced in line abreast with spacing tight enough to see boot prints and ground disturbance but wide enough to cover terrain. Trackers flagged breaks in vegetation, fresh scuffing on hardpan, and snag points along low branches where clothing or gear could catch. K9 handlers attempted scent acquisition with items from the lodging. In warm variable wind, results were inconclusive. Aerial assets worked daylight, slow orbits to spot contrast, light fabric, reflective surfaces, sandbar anomalies, shoreline indentations. Radios stayed disciplined. Every observation was logged with location, time, and disposition to prevent double counting and rumor. Negative findings became the first forensic product. No blood was noted on main approach paths. No clear drag marks led from the toilet block toward the riverbank. No slide gouge or collapsed edge along the most obvious slope to indicate a fresh fall. The absence of those signatures does not prove anything by itself. It sets a threshold. If an accident occurred, it likely happened where ground does not record it cleanly, or in water beyond the easy edge. If people were involved, they left no overt disturbance in the immediate footprint. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Investigators documented the physical limits of the night. Illumination at the camp edge, ambient moonlight, and the line of sight from the lodging to the first bend in the path were measured to estimate how quickly a person could vanish from view. Distances from the last seen point to the river's nearest access were walked by multiple personnel at regular and hurried paces to validate timelines. A last known safe point was established near the latrine approach. From there outward, the grid expanded in rings. Each ring had a tasking sheet: ground scan, canopy scan, shoreline scan, and recheck of anthropogenic features: fences, culverts, maintenance cuts where a person might choose a quieter route. Interviews supported the fieldwork without stretching beyond fact. Companions described routine movement that evening, no conflict, and the decision to alert staff quickly rather than wait. Staff described standard response: secure common areas, notify rangers, preserve the lodging area from unnecessary foot traffic. None of those statements introduced motive or suspect. They anchored timing and procedure. In a U.S. case file, this would read as foundational: last seen action, first alert, first sweep, and the boundaries of what the search did and did not find. Human factors did not get lost. People disappear in real parks, not on paper. Fatigue, unfamiliar ground, and the instinct to push farther than planned can expand risk. That said, the constrained window argued for proximity. Teams returned to the same sectors more than once, at different hours, to catch details missed in earlier light. Supervisors rotated personnel to reduce pattern blindness. Checklists forced fresh eyes to revisit items already cleared, because clearance on paper isn't clearance in fact, until conditions repeat. By the end of the third day, command had a clean ledger of negatives near the lodging and along the most obvious descent lines. That ledger would matter later when objects attributed to Sophia were found on land, away from a simple straight-line fall. Those discoveries will be mapped precisely in the next section. For now, the opening phase produced a tight movement radius, a documented lack of violence indicators at the lodging, and no immediate physical sign along the main approaches to water. If you weigh this like an investigator, the question is straightforward. With a short time window and quiet ground, would you push resources deeper toward the river, or tighten focus around the path network closest to the latrine? The search record shifted on the days after October 28, 2015, when field teams began logging items on land that investigators could associate to Sophia Coetzee. The value wasn't in the headline, items found, but in the map. Placement, distance, and sequence drive interpretation in a disappearance. When the ground around a last seen point stays quiet, where objects surface and how they surface becomes the next forensic lane. The first relevant recovery was a water bottle attributed to Sophia, documented by rangers, and entered with time, coordinates, and the name of the locating party. That administrative discipline matters because misattribution spreads fast in a public case. The bottle was not pulled from a river eddy. It was recorded on land, off a primary footpath, within hiking distance of the Student Education Center, but not in a straight line from the latrine approach. The note in the log read as a simple fact: item present, surface position, no obvious blood or impact marks. The absence of those features does not soften the finding. It clarifies it. An object expected to drift to water had not. Foot teams later marked a single shoe, not a pair, not in step formation. The position was again on land, in light brush that would snag fabric but not trap weight-bearing footwear without contact. The shoe's orientation and lack of a continuous track in or out suggested placement or drop rather than a foot slipping free during motion. Trackers walked concentric passes looking for a match to the tread and surrounding soil. No clean transfer prints were recorded. In casework terms, the shoe raised two separate lines: how it got there and why only one. Selected clothing items followed in the logs. They were found in different spots, not dumped as a bundle, not aligned along a simple downhill vector. One piece was described as caught at a height that outpaced easy brush-level snags. Another lay in low cover consistent with wind movement but had fabric tensions that argued against being blown far from a denser stand. None of these details prove staging or violence. They describe a pattern that does not mirror the typical arc of a nightfall toward the Nile. Investigators re-walked from the last seen corridor to each recovery point using measured night paces to test whether an unaided person within the documented window could account for that distribution. The math didn't settle the question, it narrowed it. Chain of custody control stayed conservative. Each item was photographed in situ, then bagged with gloves and labeled. Search supervisors documented who handled what, in what order, and where the item was stored while awaiting transfer. The goal in a remote environment is not to achieve lab sterility, that's impossible, but to prevent avoidable contamination. Logs also note what wasn't done. Teams did not reposition items for dramatic media images, did not clean them in the field, did not cluster finds for convenience. Respecting the natural context preserves options later when lab analysis tests contact versus environmental noise. Because rumors had already begun to spin, Command pushed clarifications to the family and liaison officers, which unit found which item and on which day. That reconciled conflicting early reports and prevented a recurring problem in long-running cases, the same item being rediscovered by different sources online weeks later. The record shows a water bottle recovered on land by rangers, a single shoe recorded in brush, distinct clothing items marked at separated coordinates, and no bundle drop or obvious drag line connecting them. Teams created an overlay, last seen point, toilet block, lodging perimeter, and each recovery coordinate. When plotted, the set did not read like a straight walk to water. It looked more like points of interruption. Interviews stayed close to fact. Companions were asked to account for clothing and gear Sophia wore that evening and what may have been in her possession when she left for the toilet block. Staff were asked about lost and found practices to rule out innocent transport by workers. Trackers and rangers who frequent the area were asked a narrower question. Do seasonal winds or animal traffic commonly lift or move clothing to the heights and placements documented here? The answers were practical. Loose fabric can climb brush. Shoes do not climb alone. Those statements are not conclusions. They are field experience folded into the matrix. This is where restraint earns credibility. It is easy to say the trail was staged. The file does not say that. It says the pattern is inconsistent with a single vector accident and merits testing against alternative models. If a person walked off and removed clothing, why one shoe and why the spacing? If a struggle occurred, where is the continuous disturbance? If wildlife pulled a body, why is the trail not water-oriented? Each question converts the map into hypotheses that can be tested in the next phase. Operationally, commanders responded to the pattern by adjusting search geometry. Grids expanded beyond the obvious descent corridors, and cross-slope sweeps increased to capture hidden cuts in the terrain where a person could move without leaving linear transfer. Shoreline checks continued, but the emphasis shifted. If the object set resisted a simple gravity narrative, searchers would treat these finds as anchor points and use them to frame additional sectors inland. That pivot did not abandon the accident model. It prevented the investigation from collapsing into a single assumption. This case carries human weight, and the file reflects it without dramatics. Family updates emphasized accuracy, what was found, where, and by whom. Investigators know that clarity invites better tips. In parks and reserves, locals, guides, and repeat visitors recognize how objects usually move, or don't. When a map conflicts with habit, the right witness will often spot the mismatch. That's not sentiment, it's practical outreach. The object trail now exists as data, discrete land recoveries associated with Sophia, separated by terrain and timestamps, lacking a single connecting drag or downhill flow. It is the strongest argument against a neat, unobserved slide to the river and the cleanest on-ramp to the forensic questions that follow. Next, we will examine what laboratory work could and could not draw from these items, and how those limits shaped every conversation that came afterward. Laboratory work began once the recovery map on land was stable enough to justify packaging and transport. Items associated with Sophia Coetzee were photographed where found, placed in clean bags, labeled with time, GPS, and handler, and secured for later analysis. In a remote park, Chain of custody can't mirror a metropolitan crime lab, but the goal is the same. Document every hand that touches an item and every location it passes through. That record would matter months and years later when questions shifted from what was found to what does it mean. Independent testing in the Netherlands reported unknown male DNA on selected materials linked to the object trail, on a garment fragment, an insole, and intimate clothing. Profiles from 7 Ugandan officers who handled evidence in the early response were compared and did not match those signals. The finding is significant. It is not dispositive. Touch DNA is real, but it is also fragile. It can arrive by primary contact or be carried in by secondary transfer. In open terrain, humidity, heat, and particulate matter push results toward uncertainty if the collection context is not airtight, and no field context is airtight. Examiners approach the samples as low-template, high-risk exhibits. That means they treated any partial profiles with caution, repeated amplifications where possible, and looked for consistency across replicate runs rather than chasing one-off peaks. The practical translation for a case narrative is blunt. The lab could point to unknown male contribution on some items, but it could not fix contact to a clock, a location, or an act. Without a body, there is no autopsy to cross-check with injury patterns, trauma timing, or trace from a victim's internal surfaces. The lab result adds weight to the idea that another person's biological material is present. It does not say how or why it got there. Chain of custody logs were reread against each positive DNA callout. Who bagged the item? Who carried it? Was the bag opened in the field for additional photographs or left sealed until delivery? Were gloves changed between items? These are boring questions until a jury or a family needs reasons to trust a conclusion. The logs here were serviceable, not perfect. Field teams documented photographs in place, bagging, and transfers. They also documented what was not done. No field cleaning, no display staging, no consolidation of finds for convenience. That restraint reduces avoidable transfer, but it never eliminates it. Investigators also tested the negative space around the data. If unknown male DNA is present on a shoe insole and intimate clothing, could that DNA have arrived from an earlier unrelated contact? Yes. Could it have arrived from a handler during search or packaging? Less likely if gloves were changed properly, but still possible. Could environmental contact alone, without person-to-person transfer, produce the profile strength reported? In most outdoor cases, pure environmental deposition yields weak, degraded signal. Still, cross-contamination through shared surfaces cannot be dismissed if items were placed on the same tarp or table in sequence. These aren't excuses to ignore a result, they are the quality checks that keep a file honest. One operational consequence was immediate. The presence of non-matching male DNA on multiple items made a single-vector accident less comfortable. It did not erase that model, but it forced command to preserve more options. Search grids were kept open inland longer than a standard riverfall scenario would justify. Leads involving unknown males in the vicinity, drivers, laborers, unaffiliated visitors, were cataloged rather than dismissed as noise. None of those names became a person of interest on the strength of DNA alone. The lab pointed to possibility. Fieldwork had to find probability. Interviews returned to the basics: clothing ownership and use, laundry patterns during the trip, shared handling of water bottles, and whether any items had been lent to others in the days before the disappearance. Routine questions can feel clinical to families already under strain. Here, clarity helps. Explaining that a DNA hit might reflect a handshake that transferred cells to fabric, which then transferred again during wear, makes the conversation less adversarial. It also prevents a common mistake, treating a DNA presence as a direct proxy for violence. DNA says, someone touched this, not someone attacked here. Evidence technicians revisited storage conditions after the first round of results. Items were re-inventoried, seals checked, and documentation updated to reflect any reopenings for additional swabs. When cases travel across borders for testing, every step multiplies the number of custodians, and with it, the number of questions a defense attorney or a skeptical viewer will ask later. The record in this case acknowledges those steps and doesn't overpromise. That modesty is a strength. Overstating certainty is how true leads die in the comment section. The forensic picture by itself does 3 things. First, it confirms that some items linked to Sophia carry unknown male DNA that does not match the officers tested. Second, it places that fact inside real-world limits: touch transfer, secondary movement, environmental exposure, and the absence of an autopsy to triangulate timing. Third, it guides the next moves. Preserve inland sectors, interview widely but document tightly, and avoid narratives that outrun the data. The investigation respected those lines. It is not dramatic, it is competent. There is a human layer that can be delivered without violating those lines. Families don't need drama, they need clarity. When people donate time, photos, or local knowledge, accuracy repays that trust. If you know the difference between a staged claim and a cautious inference, you become part of the solution in a case with very few anchors. In parks and towns alike, certainty doesn't come from one dazzling test. It comes from repeated careful steps that don't contradict each other. For viewers who want the clean edge, a match, a motive, a name, this chapter won't satisfy that urge, and it shouldn't. The responsible move is to keep the result where it belongs, as evidence that complicates a neat accident and keeps the door open to human involvement by person or persons unknown. The next section will show how authorities in the family took that same data and arrived at different operating theories, one highlighting what is common in these environments, the other emphasizing what is inconsistent on this map. That divergence is not a fight. It is a fork the case must address. By the time the object map and preliminary lab reports were on the table, the investigation sat on a fork that every wilderness case eventually meets. One path favored what local authorities see most in river parks: an unwitnessed accident near water, sometimes with wildlife as a secondary factor. The other path, argued by the family, treated the land-based sequence of finds and the unknown male DNA as incompatible with a simple fall. The same facts, two frameworks, and two very different operational consequences. The official accident theory begins with plausibility. The Student Education Center sits near terrain that flows toward the Nile. Night movement on unfamiliar ground increases the risk of missteps, especially off the main path. Hippos and crocodiles are not abstractions here. They are routine hazards. In that framework, the absence of remains is not extraordinary. People disappear into rivers. Recovery is not guaranteed, and predation or submergence can erase what search teams hope to find. If you accept that model, resource allocation follows a familiar pattern. Concentrate on shoreline checks, look for subtle river markers, bank slides, caught fabric at water level, new scours, and treat inland anomalies as noise unless they present a direct lead. Authorities could point to statistics from similar environments: bodies recovered late or not at all, incidents after dark where a single misstep ends the timeline. They could point to a lack of blood or obvious disturbance near the lodging as neutral to the accident model rather than a strike against it. In their view, the most common explanation remained available. Common doesn't mean certain, but it does mean you test it first. The family's position started from the same map and landed somewhere else. Items attributed to Sophia were recovered on land, not pulled from an eddy or lifted off a low branch on the immediate river edge. The spacing and placement resisted a single downhill vector. One shoe without its pair argued against a straightforward walk-and-slip narrative. Independent testing reported unknown male DNA on selected items: an insole, intimate clothing, a garment fragment, with non-matches to officers who handled early evidence. None of that proves assault. It does mean an accident-only narrative has to carry extra weight to overcome the land pattern and the lab signal. Under that logic, interviews should widen inland, potential human contacts should be recorded and checked, and the case should not close on probability when the map reads like points of interruption. The two tracks are not enemies, they are lenses. Each chooses different risks to accept. The official lens accepts that river cases often produce little physical closure and believes the burden sits on those arguing foul play to present more than anomalies. The family's lens accepts that chain of custody in a park is imperfect and still finds the combination of land placement and non-matching male DNA persuasive enough to keep person or persons unknown on the table. Both sides are rational inside their premises. The problem comes when a case adopts one lens so firmly that the other cannot be heard. Operationally, that difference is stark. An agency that believes accident is most likely will lean on finite manpower for waterline sweeps and let inland grids taper as days pass. A family that reads the trail as inconsistent with gravity will fund or lobby for private rechecks inland, independent mapping, and broader interviews. In 2015 and beyond, those impulses ran in parallel. Search commanders did not abandon river corridors, but they held inland sectors open longer than a textbook accident would demand. That compromise did not satisfy anyone completely. It kept the file alive. Where do laboratory limits fit in this split? Right in the center. Touch DNA, secondary transfer, and open terrain contamination all undermine courtroom certainty. The family acknowledged those limits and still argued that multiple hits of unknown male contribution across items associated with Sophia raised a flag that probability alone could not lower. Authorities acknowledged the hits and asked the critical follow-up: which man, where, when, and connected to what act? The lab did not answer those questions. No body was recovered. Without trauma analysis or time of injury anchoring, the result remained a signal without coordinates. That is not a reason to ignore it. It is a reason to avoid overselling it. Another fracture point involved corrections to early public reporting. The family clarified which unit found the water bottle and when, and urged outlets to retire conflicting versions. That wasn't media management for show, it was investigative hygiene. In open cases, bad facts multiply. When the same item is credited to different finders months apart, the public begins to believe there are two items, not one. Clean records preserve tip quality. On this, both tracks should meet. Accuracy helps everyone. A careful narrator has to confront a hard truth about these cases. The park does not yield to will. Even a perfect search can miss, and even a careful lab can only describe what is present, not what happened. The accident theory leans on that reality. The family's theory leans on another. People do things in the dark that leave light traces. The data align too cleanly for comfort: quiet lodging, no drag to water, items placed on land, unknown male DNA, yet never cohered into a name, a time, and a charge. In towns or reserves, unsolved does not always mean unknowable. It means unproven with the tools you have. There is a human cost to choosing a lens too early. When officials close ranks around a common explanation, families feel erased. When families declare foul play without evidentiary footing, officials feel accused of ignoring probability. The way forward in this file is unglamorous and disciplined. Let both tracks inform priorities without letting either declare victory. Keep the river honest. Keep inland options funded. Keep interviews wide but documented. Keep the language tight enough that no sentence outruns the facts. From a distance, it is easy to ask for certainty. Up close, you learn to value coherence. A coherent case says exactly what is known and what is not, and it shows why each decision was made at the time with the information available. That coherence is respect for the missing, for the family, and for the public who may hold the one fact that improves the map. If this investigation eventually turns on a single witness, that person is more likely to speak when the record does not waffle between stories or promise what the evidence cannot deliver. In the next section, we move from competing frameworks to a specific legal development: the 2025 courtroom proceedings involving the tour driver guide's licensing and alleged negligence. That matter did not decide cause, but it did force everyone to articulate standards, responsibilities, and what should have happened around visitors under professional care. Cases advance in steps. This was one of them. When the case reached a Kampala courtroom in 2025, it wasn't to name a killer or close a file. It was to test duties: who was licensed to guide, what standards applied to visitor safety, and whether negligence played a role around the trip that preceded the disappearance. The proceeding sat beside the investigation, not on top of it. That distinction matters. A regulatory case can tighten procedures without answering why a person vanished. The state framed the issue narrowly. At the time of the 2015 road trip to Murchison Falls National Park, the tour driver guide's licensing status and compliance with professional obligations were examined against tourism regulations. The court heard how itineraries are approved, how after-dark movements should be briefed, and what a guide is expected to do when a guest walks off momentarily, especially near water and wildlife. None of this asserted a cause of disappearance. It tested whether the conduct around the outing met the rules that exist to prevent avoidable harm. Witnesses filled in process, not drama. Park officials explain standard orientation for visitors, paths to use, zones to avoid, and the expectation that bathroom trips after dusk are supervised or buddy system. The lodging side described lighting, sightlines, and how quickly staff escalated once companions raised concern. A parent gave the timeline from the family's perspective and pressed the same point made in public for years. The pattern of on-land item recoveries and the unknown male DNA did not sit comfortably with a simple accident narrative. The court did not try that question. It could listen to it. Attorneys argued scope. The defense emphasized that licensing and paperwork do not prove or disprove what happened in the dark on October 28, 2015. The prosecution countered that licenses exist precisely because guides manage risk in unpredictable environments. If systems were loose, the state wanted them tightened. If they were followed, the record should reflect it. Either way, the rulebook and whether it was met belonged on the record. For investigators, the courtroom's value was practical. Regardless of outcome, testimony forced agencies and operators to articulate protocols in plain language. That clarity helps future cases and helps viewers understand why scene of disappearance remained the only correct label here. There was no reclassification to homicide, no finding that assigned cause. The case stayed open. The proceeding existed so the next traveler is less dependent on luck and the next search has fewer unknowns in the first hour. Narration in a moment like this requires restraint. It is tempting to read a regulatory charge as an implicit verdict on the disappearance. It is not. It is also tempting to dismiss the courtroom as irrelevant because it cannot say who did what. That misses the point. Systems either reduce risk or they don't. Families measure progress in inches, a clearer rule, a faster escalation, a wider buddy policy after dark. Those inches matter when the rest of the map still holds questions. The record as of September 22, 2025 remains unchanged on the central facts. No body recovered, no homicide charge filed, and a parallel legal matter that addressed licensing and alleged negligence without determining cause. Coherence is the promise we make to the audience and to the family. One case, one timeline, one status until evidence justifies a change. Casework moves when competing explanations face the same dataset. Here, the dataset is fixed, a verified last-seen walk toward the toilet block at the Student Education Center inside Murchison Falls National Park on October 28, 2015. Organized searches that documented negative findings near the lodging and along obvious descent lines. Items linked to Sophia Coetzier recovered on land, not as a single bundle. And independent testing that reported unknown male DNA on selected items with non-matches to 7 officers who handled early evidence. No body has been recovered as of September 22, 2025. With that record set, investigators compare 3 models for fit, not preference. The accident model asks whether a night misstep toward the Nile can account for the absence of disturbance near the path and the later land recoveries. Terrain does create blind zones, and a fall can occur without visible slide marks under certain ground conditions. Yet a clean corridor around the latrine approach and a lack of continuous ground transfer reduce the model's comfort. To stay viable, this explanation relies on an event in a sector that records poorly and on later object movement independent of the initial fall. The model is possible. It struggles under the current map. The wildlife model considers hippos and crocodiles as primary or secondary actors after a near-water incident. In those cases, search teams often expect low-level indicators, bank scours, fabric at waterline, or later shoreline recoveries. None were documented in the early window. Wildlife remains a persistent risk in this park, but the land-based distribution of items and the absence of water-oriented markers limit this model's explanatory power for this specific disappearance. It cannot be ruled out. It is undersupported by the documented pattern. The person's unknown model tests whether human agency better explains scattered land recoveries and the lab signals. Unknown male DNA across selected items is consistent with contact, but cannot timestamp or locate it. Chain of custody realities in a remote search ad, uncertainty. Yet multiple hits raise the probability that another person's biological material is present on items tied to the missing student. The weakness of this model is the lack of a named subject, a witness, or a body from which to anchor trauma or sequence. Even so, when investigators score the models against placement, sequence, and laboratory limits, persons unknown retains the highest investigative value. The data align too cleanly for comfort. That was the problem. Matrix work is not theatrical, it sets priorities. In practice, this means maintaining shoreline checks to respect residual risk from accident or wildlife, while committing sustained resources inland where the object map and DNA findings keep the door open. It means broad interviews with unaffiliated males known to be in the vicinity that week and recontacting guides, workers, and repeat visitors who can speak to how fabric and footwear tend to move in that terrain. It also means avoiding overreach. None of the models permit a definitive statement on cause, and none justify a public suspect without corroboration. There is a simple operational rule for cases like this. Preserve the model that explains the most known facts with the fewest unsupported assumptions. On that test, a strictly accidental riverfall sits behind persons unknown until new evidence moves it forward. Families deserve that clarity, and so do search teams who have to decide where the next hour goes. In towns and in reserves, uncertainty is not an excuse to stand still. It is a reason to work the data you have without distorting it. In cases like this, accuracy is oxygen. Small corrections, who found an item, on which day and where it was logged, kept this file coherent and prevented rumor from multiplying into false leads. The family's updates and steady outreach did something practical. They sharpened the public's picture without relitigating the entire map. That clarity matters more than volume. It channels tips toward the windows of time and the sectors that can still move an open case. Advocacy also means procedure that outlives a headline. Guides and operators in high-risk parks should be verifiably licensed, brief night movement as a rule, and document escalations in minutes, not hours. Visitors can lower risk without fear or drama. Move in pairs after dark. Carry a light and a whistle. Tell someone precisely where you're going. If you encounter clothing or gear in unusual positions, don't disturb it. Note location and report. These aren't moral lessons, they're practical steps that give search teams a fair start if something goes wrong. Transparency about evidence kept expectations realistic. Land recoveries associated with Sophia and later laboratory findings complicated a neat accident narrative, but they did not identify a person or fix a moment in time. The investigation treated those signals as reason to preserve inland options while still respecting residual river risk. That balance, probability on one side, anomalies on the other, allowed the file to stay honest without closing doors that shouldn't be closed. There was a courtroom step in 2025, and its value was structural. By testing guide licensing and alleged negligence, it forced standards onto the record, what a professional should do near water and wildlife, how night movements are managed, and how quickly staff respond when a guest does not return. It did not decide cause. It did make future searches likelier to start with better information and fewer assumptions. I'm leaving you with this: facts matter, and so does the way we carry them. I learned that accuracy isn't cold, it's compassion. When we check licenses, move in pairs after dark, and report what we see instead of touching it, we protect strangers we'll never meet. Sophia's story reminds me to choose coherence over rumor and persistence over easy endings. What detail in this case stood out to you, and why? Tell me where you're watching from. If this resonated, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. If it didn't, say why and how I can do better. Your voice helps us get closer to the truth.